Somewhere in the southern Red Sea, a container ship carrying automotive parts from South Korea to Rotterdam adjusts its course. The change is small, just a few degrees, but the reason behind it is being tracked by a dozen shipping operations centers across 3 continents simultaneously. Lloyd's of London has just updated its war risk zone designation for a stretch of water roughly 30 kilometers wide. Within the hour, 3 major shipping conglomerates issue internal advisories. Within 6 hours, insurance premiums for Red Sea transit will climb by a figure that, in normal market conditions, would represent weeks of negotiation. By the following morning, 7 vessels that were bound for the Suez Canal have communicated course changes to maritime traffic management services. They are heading south and east, away from the strait, toward the long southern arc around the Cape of Good Hope. None of this makes front-page news immediately. There are no dramatic images of burning ships. No naval battle has occurred. What has happened is something more systemic and, in many ways, more consequential. The global shipping network has begun to reroute itself around a 30-kilometer gap in the map. That gap is the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. It connects the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden. It links the Suez Canal to the Indian Ocean, and through it passes an estimated 10 to 15% of global trade by volume: energy shipments, consumer goods, automotive components, agricultural products, electronics, the physical circulation of the world economy moving between Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. When this strait functions normally, it is essentially invisible, so ships pass through it continuously, 24 hours a day, and the world does not notice. When it does not function normally, when threats emerge, when shipping companies reassess risk, when naval assets begin repositioning, the effects radiate outward through supply chains, fuel markets, freight rates, and manufacturing timelines across dozens of countries that may never appear on a map of the region. This is not a story about a local conflict. It is an analysis of a structural vulnerability in the global logistics system, one that has been tested repeatedly, is being tested again, and will almost certainly be tested in the future. This is how Bab el-Mandeb works. This is what happens when it stops working, and this is how the global system responds. To understand why Bab el-Mandeb carries such strategic weight, it is necessary to begin not with a crisis, but with geography. The strait sits at the southwestern tip of the Arabian Peninsula, forming the narrow connection between the Red Sea to the north and the Gulf of Aden to the south. At its narrowest point, the passage measures approximately 29 kilometers between the Yemeni coastline on the Arabian side and the Djiboutian and Eritrean coastlines on the African side. A small island, Perim Island, controlled by Yemen, sits near the center of the strait, further dividing the navigable channel into 2 separate lanes: a deeper western lane approximately 16 kilometers wide, and a shallower eastern lane of approximately 3 kilometers used primarily by smaller vessels and dhow traffic. The name itself, Bab el-Mandeb, translates from Arabic as Gate of Grief or Gate of Tears, a name derived, according to historical accounts, either from the dangerous navigation conditions of its rocky passages or from the number of sailors and travelers lost in its waters over centuries of maritime commerce. That commerce stretches back into antiquity. Ancient trade routes connecting the Mediterranean world to the Indian Ocean passed through this corridor. Egyptian and Roman merchants moving spices, silk, and incense from Arabia and India northward into the Mediterranean relied on the Red Sea as a critical transit corridor. The strait at its southern end was not merely a geographic feature. It was a commercial gateway, and control over it, or access through it, carried real economic and political significance even in the ancient world. But the modern strategic importance of Bab el-Mandeb, however, is inseparable from the construction of the Suez Canal, completed in 1869. Before the canal, European shipping bound for Asia had no practical alternative to the Cape of Good Hope route, the long circumnavigation of the African continent that added weeks to every voyage. The Suez Canal transformed that calculus entirely. Suddenly, the Red Sea was not a dead end, but a through route. Ships could enter the Mediterranean from the north, pass through the canal into the Red Sea, transit Bab el-Mandeb at the southern end, and continue into the Gulf of Aden, the Arabian Sea, and the broader Indian Ocean. This routing has been the dominant framework for Asia-Europe maritime trade ever since. Ships carrying goods from manufacturing centers in China, South Korea, Japan, and Southeast Asia toward European consumer markets follow this corridor. Tankers moving crude oil from the Persian Gulf toward European refineries follow this corridor. Container ships, bulk carriers, vehicle carriers, chemical tankers, the full range of global commercial maritime traffic flows through this single narrow point. The volume is significant. Estimates from maritime analytics firms and international organizations consistently place Bab el-Mandeb among the top 5 most critical maritime choke points globally, alongside the Strait of Hormuz, the Strait of Malacca, the Danish Straits, and the Turkish Straits. Approximately 5 to 6 million barrels of oil per day have historically transited the strait during periods of normal operation, in addition to the massive containerized goods flows that represent a significant share of Suez-linked shipping. The strategic significance of this geography was not lost on the major powers of the 20th century. During the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union maintained naval presences in the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea region, partly as a function of broader superpower competition and partly because of the explicit understanding that control over, or denial of, key maritime choke points represented genuine strategic leverage. Soviet naval doctrine, in particular, developed concepts around the use of submarine and surface forces to threaten Western commercial sea lanes in a major conflict, and Bab el-Mandeb featured in those calculations as a point where shipping traffic could be concentrated and therefore targeted. The end of the Cold War reduced the salience of superpower naval competition in the region, but it did not eliminate the strategic significance of the strait. Instead, the nature of the threat shifted. The collapse of the Somali state in the early 1990s created conditions for the rise of maritime piracy in the Gulf of Aden and the Western Indian Ocean, a phenomenon that reached its most acute phase in the late 2000s and early 2010s. Somali piracy at its peak represented a genuine commercial disruption to shipping transiting the region, with hundreds of vessels attacked and dozens seized for ransom over a multi-year period. The response, a coordinated multinational anti-piracy effort involving naval forces from the United States, the European Union, NATO, China, India, Russia, and numerous other nations, demonstrated both the vulnerability of commercial shipping in this corridor and the capacity of the international community to organize a collective response when commercial interests were sufficiently threatened. Anti-piracy operations in the Gulf of Aden, most notably EU Naval Force Operation Atalanta, Combined Maritime Forces CTF-151, and the NATO Ocean Shield Mission, established patterns of maritime patrol, convoy escort, and naval coordination in the region that would prove relevant to later crises. The other defining contextual development is the Yemen conflict, which began in earnest in 2014 and 2015, and has, with varying intensity and in different forms, continued to reshape the strategic environment around Bab el-Mandeb ever since. In the Houthi movement, formerly known as Ansar Allah, emerged from the Sada region of northern Yemen, drew on deep Zaidi Shia religious and political identity, and benefited from Iranian support in terms of weapons, training, and strategic guidance. The Saudi-led coalition intervention in 2015, launched in response to Houthi territorial gains, including the capture of the capital Sana'a, drew in regional powers, internationalized the conflict, and created a sustained military and humanitarian crisis that positioned armed non-state actors in direct proximity to one of the world's most critical shipping corridors. The Houthi movement, over the course of the Yemen conflict, developed a maritime warfare capability that went well beyond what most analysts had initially anticipated from a land-based insurgent group. Were this development, drawing on Iranian anti-ship missile technology, locally adapted drone systems, fast attack craft, and reported access to naval mines, represents the core asymmetric maritime threat dynamic that shapes the Bab el-Mandeb security environment. Understanding how that capability developed and how it interacts with the command structures of international naval forces, commercial shipping systems, and regional state actors is essential to understanding how a disruption scenario at Bab el-Mandeb actually unfolds. Section 3. Actors, Forces, and Organizations. The Bab el-Mandeb strategic environment involves a more complex array of actors than almost any other comparable maritime chokepoint. Unlike the Strait of Hormuz, where Iranian state naval and paranaval forces represent the dominant asymmetric threat actor, in Bab el-Mandeb features multiple overlapping layers of state, non-state, and multinational actors, each with distinct command structures, capabilities, decision-making processes, and interests. The Houthi Maritime Force. The most immediately relevant threat actor in the current environment is the Houthi Maritime Force, a component of the broader Houthi military structure that has developed a capacity to threaten commercial and naval shipping in the Red Sea and the approaches to Bab el-Mandeb. The Houthis do not operate a conventional naval force in the traditional sense. They do not possess a recognized fleet of surface combatants, submarines, or carrier aviation. What they have developed instead is an asymmetric maritime warfare capability built around three primary systems: anti-ship cruise missiles, maritime strike drones, and explosive-laden unmanned surface vessels. The anti-ship missile inventory available to Houthi forces includes systems derived from Iranian anti-ship missile technology, variants of the Noor, Qatar, and related cruise missile families that have been transferred, assembled, or reverse-engineered within Yemen over the course of the conflict. These systems carry warheads in the 300-kilogram range, can engage targets at ranges from 60 to over 150 kilometers depending on the variant, and fly at low altitude to reduce radar detection time. They represent a genuine threat to commercial shipping transiting the Red Sea, not because they are particularly advanced by the standards of modern naval warfare, but because commercial vessels have essentially no active defense capability against them. For maritime strike drones, both fixed-wing loitering munitions and modified commercial drone platforms adapted for maritime attack, represent a lower-cost but complementary capability. These systems can be deployed in numbers, can be difficult to detect at low altitude and low speed, and can be guided toward targets using a combination of satellite navigation and optical or radar seekers. The use of swarm tactics, multiple simultaneous drone attacks from different vectors, complicates point defense for even well-equipped naval escorts. Explosive-laden unmanned surface vessels, which Houthi forces have referred to as naval drones in their public communications, represent a third component. These are essentially small, fast boats packed with explosives and guided remotely or autonomously toward target vessels. They have been used against Saudi naval assets and, in more recent operational contexts, against commercial shipping. The threat posed by these systems in the confined waters near Bab el-Mandeb is significant, particularly against slower-moving commercial targets. The command and control structure of the Houthi maritime force is not fully transparent to external observers, which is itself strategically significant. Targeting decisions, which vessels to attack, when, and with which systems, appear to be made at a relatively senior level within the Houthi military structure, with Iranian advisory involvement at least at the strategic and technical guidance level. Operational execution is managed by specialized units with maritime warfare training and technical expertise that, by all available evidence, exceeds what might be expected from an organization whose origins are entirely land-based. This creates a command structure that is deliberately opaque, resilient to decapitation because it does not depend on a single coherent hierarchical chain in the conventional military sense, and capable of what might be termed strategic harassment. Sustained low-level attacks designed not necessarily to achieve decisive military results, but to impose costs on adversaries and demonstrate capability and resolve. Iranian involvement in the Houthi maritime capability is documented by multiple sources, including UN Panel of Experts reports, naval intelligence assessments from multiple governments, and physical evidence recovered from weapons systems. The nature of that involvement, whether it constitutes direct operational command, or technical advisory support, weapons provision, or some combination of all three, matters for understanding escalation dynamics. Iran's strategic interest in Bab el-Mandeb is straightforward. A maritime choke point that can be threatened or closed serves as leverage in negotiations over sanctions, regional influence, and deterrence against military action. Iran does not need to physically control Bab el-Mandeb to benefit from the threat of disruption there. Maintaining a proxy capability that can raise insurance rates, divert shipping, and force the deployment of expensive naval assets by adversaries represents a form of strategic pressure that costs Iran relatively little compared to the economic and operational costs it imposes on others. And this logic, using proxy maritime forces to impose disproportionate costs on commercial shipping and the naval powers that protect it, is a consistent feature of Iranian strategic behavior in multiple maritime contexts, including the Strait of Hormuz, the Gulf of Oman, and the wider Red Sea. The Saudi-led coalition that intervened in Yemen in 2015 includes, in addition to Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Kuwait, and a rotating set of contributing nations. The coalition has maintained a naval component that has operated in the Red Sea and the approaches to the strait throughout the conflict, conducting enforcement of a maritime blockade on Houthi-controlled ports, interdicting weapons shipments, and attempting to degrade Houthi maritime warfare capabilities. Saudi Arabia operates a surface fleet that includes frigates and corvettes of French and American origin, the Al-Madina-class frigates and the Badr-class corvettes, as well as a small submarine force. The Royal Saudi Naval Force operates from facilities at Jeddah on the Red Sea coast and Jubail on the Gulf coast, and has extended its operational reach southward into the approaches to Bab el-Mandeb over the course of the Yemen conflict. The UAE contributed significant naval assets to the coalition operation and has maintained a forward presence at Asab in Eritrea, a base established with Eritrean government agreement that gives UAE forces a position directly adjacent to the Bab el-Mandeb choke point on the African side of the strait. This positioning is strategically significant. It provides a platform for surveillance, patrol, and potential interdiction operations in immediate proximity to the strait's western approach. Djibouti, despite not being formally part of the Saudi-led coalition, is among the most strategically important states in the Bab el-Mandeb environment. Its position directly on the southwestern approach to the strait, combined with its small but growing importance as a host nation for foreign military bases, makes it a critical node in any serious maritime security operation in the region. The United States, France, China, Japan, and several other nations maintain military facilities in Djibouti, creating an unusual concentration of foreign military presence at a single location adjacent to a major choke point. U.S. naval operations in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden fall under U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM, for theater-level authority, but with Naval Component Command exercised through Naval Forces Central Command, NAVCENT, which is dual-hatted as the commander of U.S. Fifth Fleet, headquartered in Manama, Bahrain. The command structure governing U.S. naval operations in the region is a layered one. CENTCOM sets theater priorities and oversees operational coordination with coalition partners. Fifth Fleet/NAVCENT translates those priorities into maritime operations, patrol schedules, escort assignments, intelligence collection, and rules of engagement for naval forces operating in the area of responsibility. Task force commanders below fleet level manage specific operational elements. Combined Task Force 150 focused on maritime security and counter-narcotics, CTF 151 focused on counter-piracy, and other task forces as activated for specific contingencies. When a maritime crisis in the Bab el-Mandeb region requires a more intensive naval response, as occurred during the peak of Houthi maritime attacks in late 2023 and 2024, the command structure expands to integrate additional assets. Carrier strike groups provide air power for offensive strike options and defensive combat air patrols. Destroyer and cruiser escorts provide anti-air and anti-missile defense. Submarines provide subsurface situational awareness. The integration of these elements under a coherent operational command structure is a significant undertaking, managed through the established Fifth Fleet framework and coordinated with multinational partners through combined maritime forces, or commercial shipping companies and maritime insurance networks. One of the most consequential actors in any Bab el-Mandeb disruption scenario is not a naval force. It is the commercial shipping industry and the insurance system that underlies it. Major container shipping companies, Maersk, MSC, CMA CGM, COSCO, Evergreen, operate globally integrated route networks with limited flexibility to absorb sudden changes in transit costs and times. These companies employ dedicated maritime security teams that monitor threat assessments from Lloyd's of London, the Joint War Committee, and specialist maritime security consultancies. When threat levels rise, their decision-making process is driven primarily by insurance liability, crew welfare obligations under international maritime law, and the financial calculus between higher insurance premiums for a short but threatened route versus the added time and fuel cost of a longer but safer one. The maritime insurance market, centered primarily in London but involving syndicates and underwriters globally, is a critical early warning and early response mechanism in any shipping disruption. War risk premiums are priced daily, sometimes hourly during acute crises, by underwriters who are continuously updating their assessments based on incident reports, naval intelligence feeds, and political risk analysis. A spike in war risk premiums for Red Sea transit does not require a ship to actually be hit. The mere credible threat of attack, communicated through intelligence channels and reflected in insurance pricing, is sufficient to trigger rerouting decisions by commercial operators. This dynamic, insurance-driven commercial withdrawal preceding military escalation, is one of the most important and least appreciated features of modern maritime choke point disruption. The ships leave the lane before the shooting, if the threat signals are credible enough. Understanding this mechanism is essential to understanding how a Bab el-Mandeb disruption scenario develops in practice. A disruption at Bab el-Mandeb does not happen in a vacuum. It happens within a system of interconnected commercial, military, and logistical infrastructure, each element of which responds to stress in predictable ways, that collectively amplify the initial disruption far beyond its immediate geographic scope. And the Bab el-Mandeb Strait sits at the southern end of a shipping corridor that begins at the northern entrance to the Red Sea, the Suez Canal at Port Said in Egypt, and extends approximately 1,900 kilometers southward through the Red Sea itself before reaching the strait. This entire corridor is a managed maritime highway. Traffic separation schemes designate northbound and southbound lanes. Port State Control, Suez Canal Authority transit procedures, and vessel traffic services at key points along the route coordinate the movement of hundreds of vessels daily. The routing rigidity of this system is both its efficiency and its vulnerability. The ships do not distribute themselves randomly across available ocean space. They concentrate in defined corridors because those corridors represent the optimal path between origin and destination, given the constraints of canal infrastructure, port locations, and ocean routing economics. This concentration is precisely what makes choke point disruption so impactful. You do not need to threaten all of the ocean to disrupt all of the shipping. You need only to make the narrow points in the system unusable or economically prohibitive. The alternative to the Red Sea-Suez route for Asia-Europe shipping is the Cape of Good Hope routing, transiting south around the tip of Africa and northward into the Atlantic. This adds approximately 10 to 14 days to a typical Asia-Europe voyage, depending on origin and destination ports. For a vessel consuming 300 to 500 tons of bunker fuel per day, this additional transit time represents a direct additional fuel cost of approximately $2 to $3 million per voyage on a large container ship. Multiplied across hundreds of vessels rerouting simultaneously, the economic impact on freight costs is immediate and significant. Naval escort of commercial shipping in threatened maritime environments is not a new concept. It was practiced extensively during both World Wars and during the tanker war of the 1980s in the Persian Gulf. But its modern implementation involves a more complex interplay of national assets, multinational coordination structures, and commercial cooperation frameworks than earlier historical examples. And the current framework for naval escort and maritime security in the Red Sea Gulf of Aden corridor involves several overlapping structures. Operation Prosperity Guardian, established by the United States in late 2023 in response to Houthi attacks on commercial shipping, represented an attempt to create a coalition naval presence capable of providing both deterrence and active defense for commercial vessels transiting the threatened area. The operational concept involved not a traditional convoy system, in which commercial vessels are grouped and physically escorted through the threatened zone by accompanying warships, but rather a distributed patrol and response model in which naval vessels maintain positions from which they can respond to attacks on commercial shipping in their vicinity. The Maritime Patrol aircraft, P-8 Poseidon and equivalent platforms from U.S. and Allied air forces, provide extended surveillance coverage of the shipping lanes and the coastal areas from which missile and drone attacks might originate. These aircraft carry sensors capable of detecting surface vessels at significant ranges, monitoring coastal activity, and providing targeting data for naval surface and subsurface forces. Their persistent presence over the shipping lanes is both an intelligence collection asset and a deterrence signal. The asymmetric maritime threat environment around Bab el-Mandeb is shaped by the proliferation of anti-ship cruise missiles and maritime strike drones to non-state actors, a development that fundamentally alters the military geography of the strait. Traditional maritime choke point security analysis focused on the ability of state naval forces to control a strait through a combination of surface warships, submarines, and land-based air power. The implicit assumption was that only state actors possessed the capability to threaten major naval formations or commercial shipping at the scale required to cause strategic disruption. The development of precision-guided anti-ship missiles by Iran and their transfer to regional proxy forces, including Houthi forces in Yemen, has invalidated this assumption. A single anti-ship cruise missile of the type available to Houthi forces is sufficient to inflict serious damage on a commercial vessel. A commercial container ship or tanker has no active defense, no close-in weapon systems, no electronic warfare capability, no decoy launchers. Its only protection against such a threat is avoidance. This asymmetry between the cost of a missile attack and the cost of a commercial vessel's destruction or damage is the foundation of the economic logic that drives rerouting decisions even when attacks are infrequent. The drone threat adds a layer of complexity because of the difficulty of reliable early warning. A low-flying, slow-moving drone launched from a coastal position may not be detected by ship-based radar systems until it is within a few kilometers of the target. Naval escort vessels with sophisticated anti-air systems can engage such targets, but the engagement geometry depends heavily on detection time, which is compressed in the confined maritime environment near the strait. Naval mines represent a historically proven and strategically significant capability for chokepoint denial. The Houthi force is assessed to possess a naval mine capability, and the use of mines in Yemeni waters has been documented on multiple occasions during the conflict. Mines are attractive to asymmetric actors for several reasons. They are relatively inexpensive, they are difficult to detect and remove, they create persistent uncertainty even after active mine laying has ceased, and they impose significant costs on commercial shipping in terms of insurance premiums and transit risk, regardless of whether individual ships are actually struck. A credible mining threat in the approaches to Bab el-Mandeb, even without confirmed mine strikes on commercial vessels, is sufficient to drive insurance underwriters to increase war risk premiums substantially and to prompt some commercial operators to suspend transit. Mine sweeping and mine hunting operations require specialized naval assets, mine countermeasures vessels, that are not present in large numbers in the regional naval forces and must be specifically deployed in response to a mine threat. The ability of naval commanders, commercial shipping companies, and intelligence agencies to understand what is happening in the Bab el-Mandeb area in real time depends on a layered set of surveillance and tracking systems. The Automatic Identification System, AIS, provides continuous position reporting from commercial vessels equipped with transponders. Satellite synthetic aperture radar systems can detect and image surface vessels regardless of weather or time of day. Space-based optical imagery from commercial and military satellite constellations provides periodic coverage of port facilities, coastal areas, and vessel movements. Naval patrol aircraft and unmanned aerial vehicles provide persistent real-time coverage of specific areas of interest. The integration of these systems, from space-based surveillance to naval patrol to commercial vessel tracking, into a coherent maritime domain awareness picture, is a capability that the United States and its major naval allies have developed to a high level. This capability matters because it enables early warning of threat activities, supports targeting for defensive and offensive military operations, and provides the data foundation for commercial shipping security advisories. The disruption of maritime traffic at Bab el-Mandeb does not occur as a single event. It develops through phases, each with its own logic, its own actors making distinct decisions, and its own feedback mechanisms that shape the subsequent phase. Understanding this progression is more analytically useful than focusing on any single dramatic incident. Phase 1. Rising tension and shipping risk signals. The first signs of an emerging maritime disruption scenario at Bab el-Mandeb typically precede any physical attacks on commercial shipping. They manifest in the intelligence and risk assessment layer first. The maritime security analysts monitoring the Yemen conflict and Houthi military communications begin detecting elevated rhetorical signals, public statements by Houthi leadership threatening shipping, communications intercepted by intelligence services indicating operational preparation, or observable changes in Houthi military activities along the coast of the Red Sea. These signals feed into the Joint War Committee risk assessment process in London, which reviews war risk zone designations for maritime insurance purposes. The JWC is not a government body. It is a market institution, a committee of underwriters. But its designations carry enormous practical weight because they directly affect the premiums charged to ship owners for war risk coverage in listed areas. A change in JWC designations for the Red Sea or the Gulf of Aden can trigger immediate pricing responses across the insurance market. At the same time, the security teams of major shipping companies are receiving the same intelligence signals through their own channels. Specialist maritime security consultancies, government shipping security advisories from maritime administrations in the United States, United Kingdom, and elsewhere, and direct communications from naval liaison offices associated with coalition maritime security operations. Naval command structures at Fifth Fleet begin reviewing force posture. Patrol schedules may be adjusted. Intelligence collection priorities shift toward Houthi maritime activity. Contingency planning for escort operations or defensive response is reviewed and updated. At this stage, there is no public announcement, no formal declaration of elevated threat. The activity is internal to the naval command structure. Commercial vessel operators are now making individual risk assessments. Some will decide to transit and accept the additional insurance premium. Others, particularly those operating on thin freight margins where the premium increase materially affects route economics, will begin considering alternatives. The rerouting calculus becomes active. Phase 2. Initial disruption of maritime traffic. The transition to Phase 2 is marked by the occurrence of a specific incident, or multiple incidents, that converts the threat from theoretical to demonstrated. A missile or drone attack on a commercial vessel, even if the damage is limited or the vessel is not sunk, fundamentally changes the insurance market calculus. The incident itself triggers an immediate response at multiple levels simultaneously. The targeted vessel's flag state maritime administration issues a navigational warning. Lloyd's and the JWC convene emergency assessments. Naval commands issue updated force protection guidance. Shipping company security teams convene crisis calls. Within hours, sometimes within minutes, insurance war risk premiums for Red Sea transit begin moving. The magnitude of the movement depends on the severity and context of the attack, but even a modest premium increase, from a fraction of a percent of vessel and cargo value to a full percentage point, represents a cost increase that significantly alters the economics of Suez routing for commercial operators. The commercial response is not uniform. For the largest, most efficient operators, those with the most modern vessels, the lowest fuel costs, and the highest freight rates, may continue transiting, absorbing the additional insurance cost. Smaller operators, vessels on lower margin routes, and those carrying cargo whose owners have independent risk concerns may divert. The result is a partial withdrawal, not the complete cessation of Red Sea traffic, but a measurable reduction in vessel movements and an increase in the average age and risk profile of those that continue. This partial withdrawal itself has market effects. As vessel capacity on the Red Sea-Suez route decreases, freight rates on that corridor begin to increase, creating a feedback mechanism that at some threshold reverses the rerouting calculus for some operators who had diverted, as higher freight rates now justify the insurance premium. The market is not static, it is continuously recalibrating. Naval authorities at this stage are likely to issue official maritime security communications, Navarea warnings, combined maritime forces advisories, detailing the nature of the threat, recommending specific transit precautions and indicating the presence of naval assets available to support commercial vessels in the area. Phase 3. Targeted maritime attacks and blockade behavior. If the crisis escalates further, through continued or intensified Houthi attacks, through failure of diplomatic efforts to de-escalate, or through deliberate strategic decisions by the threat actor to increase pressure, Phase 3 involves a qualitative shift in the nature of the maritime threat. And this phase is characterized by a pattern of attacks that moves beyond isolated incidents towards something more systematic. Multiple vessels targeted in a short time frame. Attacks using a combination of systems, missiles, drones, and surface vessels simultaneously. Evidence of mine placement in the approaches to the strait. Attacks that demonstrate improved targeting capability or expanded threat envelopes. At this stage, the behavior of the threat actor begins to constitute what maritime lawyers and naval analysts term constructive blockade, not the formal legal act of blockade, which requires specific procedures under international maritime law, but behavior that has the practical effect of denying safe transit to commercial shipping across a defined maritime zone. The commercial shipping response to this phase is typically more dramatic than in Phase 2. Major carriers issue suspension announcements for Red Sea service. Vessel tracking data shows a sharp decline in AIS broadcasting commercial traffic in the affected zone. Port operators at Jeddah, Aden, and other Red Sea ports begin receiving fewer vessel calls. The rerouting around the Cape of Good Hope shifts from a minority choice to the dominant commercial shipping response. The impacts now begin propagating into broader supply chain systems. Shipping capacity that was serving the Asia-Europe route is now committed to longer voyages with slower vessel rotations. Effective global container shipping capacity decreases, not because ships are lost, but because the same fleet is now achieving fewer round trips per year. And freight rates on Asia-Europe corridors begin to climb. Port congestion at alternative waypoints increases as vessel schedules are disrupted. The energy market response may be significant, particularly for crude oil and refined products moving from the Persian Gulf or Red Sea terminal facilities toward European refineries. While the Persian Gulf to Asia route is unaffected, it does not pass through Bab el-Mandeb. The Persian Gulf to Europe route through the Suez Canal does. Diversion of tankers around the Cape adds time and cost to European energy supply chains. Phase 4. International Naval Response. The international naval response to a sustained Bab el-Mandeb disruption scenario involves both the activation of existing frameworks and the potential development of new ones, depending on the severity of the crisis. Whereas at the framework level, the Combined Maritime Forces structure, headquartered in Bahrain and comprising over 40 member nations, provides the institutional architecture for multinational naval coordination in the region. Task forces within this structure can be expanded, given new mandates, or reorganized to address the specific threat profile. The U.S.-led Operation Prosperity Guardian model, establishing a dedicated multinational naval presence for commercial shipping protection, represents the kind of response that this framework enables. The operational challenge is significant. Protecting commercial shipping against a threat that includes land-based anti-ship cruise missiles requires a fundamentally different force posture than counter-piracy operations. The piracy involved small, fast boats with limited weapons, a threat that helicopter-equipped patrol vessels and armed teams embarked on commercial ships could address. Anti-ship missiles and drones require area air defense, destroyers and cruisers equipped with advanced radar and missile systems capable of detecting and engaging incoming threats at distance. The deployment of destroyer-class warships to provide area air defense for commercial shipping in the Red Sea is a significant commitment of high-value naval assets. A destroyer conducting escort and air defense operations in the Red Sea is not available for other commitments: deterrence operations in the Pacific, North Atlantic anti-submarine warfare, or other theater requirements. The opportunity cost of sustained escort operations in a lower priority theater with a high threat tempo is a genuine strategic consideration for naval planners. Offensive strike options, attacking Houthi missile and drone launch facilities, command nodes, logistics infrastructure, and weapons stockpiles on Yemeni territory, represent an alternative or complementary approach to the defensive escort model. U.S. and British forces conducted such strikes in Yemen beginning in early 2024, targeting Houthi military infrastructure using Tomahawk land attack missiles from surface ships and submarines and precision-guided munitions from strike aircraft. The military effectiveness of these strikes in terms of degrading Houthi maritime attack capability was measurable but not decisive. But the Houthi force demonstrated resilience, the ability to absorb strikes, reconstitute damaged capabilities, and continue operations, if at a somewhat degraded tempo. This resilience reflects several factors: the distributed nature of the Houthi military infrastructure, the continued flow of replacement weapons and components from Iranian supply networks, and the deep organizational adaptation that an insurgent force develops over a decade of warfare. The diplomatic dimension of the naval response involves coordination with regional states whose support, basing, overflight, intelligence sharing, is important to sustaining operations in the area. Djibouti's continued hosting of allied military facilities is foundational. Coordination with Oman, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE shapes the operational environment. On the position of Egypt, the Suez Canal state, which has direct economic interest in Red Sea shipping traffic, matters for diplomatic coherence. Phase 5. Global supply chain impact. The global supply chain impact of a sustained Bab el-Mandeb disruption reaches its full expression in Phase 5, when the rerouting of commercial shipping has been underway long enough for its effects to propagate through inventory systems, manufacturing schedules, and consumer markets. The time component is critical. A single container ship adding 14 days to an Asia-Europe voyage is a manageable disruption. Hundreds of container ships simultaneously adding 14 days to their voyages is a systemic shock to the supply chains that depend on predictable, frequent service. On manufacturers operating on just-in-time inventory principles, particularly in the automotive, electronics, and consumer goods sectors, are most immediately vulnerable. A factory in Germany that depends on a weekly container service from East Asian suppliers of components will exhaust its buffer inventory within days or weeks of a service disruption. The response, ordering larger safety stocks, shifting to air freight for critical components, sourcing from alternative suppliers, is exactly what happened during the COVID-19 shipping disruptions of 2021 and 2022, and the same dynamics apply here. The energy market response is more complex and depends heavily on the degree to which Persian Gulf producers and their European customers are able to route supply chains around the disruption. But Saudi Aramco has terminal facilities at Yanbu on the Red Sea coast, a significant export point for oil destined for Europe, and a pipeline connection across the Arabian Peninsula to Yanbu from the eastern province fields. If Red Sea tanker traffic is disrupted, some of this export capacity can be rerouted to the Arabian Gulf, but the additional voyage time around the Cape for tankers bound for European refineries still adds cost and time to European energy supply. European natural gas supply chains that depend in part on LNG, imports transiting from Qatar or the wider Gulf through the Bab el-Mandeb corridor, face similar dynamics: longer voyages, higher shipping costs, potentially reduced supply frequency during acute disruption phases. The freight rate response is one of the clearest economic signals. Our container freight rates on Asia-Europe lanes are quoted daily on major freight indices. The Shanghai Containerized Freight Index, SCFI, and the Freightos-Baltic Index being among the most widely tracked. During acute disruption phases of Houthi attacks on Red Sea shipping in late 2023 and early 2024, Asia-Europe spot rates increased by several 100% from pre-disruption levels, a magnitude of price shock comparable to peak COVID disruption rates. Phase 6. Stabilization or prolonged maritime insecurity. The resolution, or non-resolution, of a Bab el-Mandeb disruption scenario does not follow a clean narrative arc. Historical evidence suggests that maritime disruption scenarios of this type tend to stabilize not through decisive military resolution, but through a combination of sustained naval presence, the partial degradation of threat capabilities, commercial adaptation, and, eventually, a shift in the political conditions that created the threat in the first place. The partial stabilization model involves a situation in which naval escort operations and defensive strike campaigns reduce the frequency and effectiveness of attacks to a level at which commercial shipping can resume transit, albeit at higher insurance cost and with naval escort where available. This is not a return to normal operations. It is a new, higher-cost equilibrium in which shipping companies have adapted their operations. Insurance premiums remain elevated, and the threat has not been eliminated, but has been managed to a sustainable level. The prolonged insecurity model involves a situation in which the threat actor maintains sufficient capability and operational tempo to prevent a stable new equilibrium from forming. Persistent attacks, even at low frequency, sustain elevated insurance premiums and prevent the recovery of normal commercial shipping traffic. In this scenario, the economic costs of disruption continue to accumulate, not as a single shock, but as a sustained drag on trade flows and supply chain efficiency. The political resolution pathway, in which the underlying conflict that enables the maritime threat is addressed through negotiation, ceasefire, or political settlement, is the only pathway to a genuine return to normal maritime conditions. Naval operations can manage and reduce the threat, though they cannot eliminate it as long as the political conditions that sustain it persist. The strategic consequences of a Bab el-Mandeb disruption scenario extend well beyond the immediate economic and military dimensions. They illuminate deeper structural questions about the architecture of the global trading system and the vulnerabilities embedded in its dependence on a small number of maritime chokepoints. The chokepoint dependency problem. The global shipping system's dependence on the Suez-Red Sea Bab el-Mandeb corridor is a structural feature of the world economy, not an accident or an oversight. The Suez Canal's construction in 1869 created an irresistible competitive advantage for the Red Sea route over the Cape of Good Hope alternative, a shorter distance, lower fuel consumption, faster transit times. Over more than a century and a half, global port infrastructure, manufacturing location decisions, trade agreements, and logistics systems have all been organized around this routing. This deep structural dependence means that rerouting is not simply a matter of ships taking a different path. It means disrupting the entire economic logic of supply chains that were designed and optimized for a specific routing. The transition costs, additional inventory, higher freight rates, longer lead times are real and significant, even if the global trading system ultimately proves capable of absorbing them. And the lesson is not that the world should stop using the Suez-Bab el-Mandeb corridor, the efficiency advantages are too great to abandon, but that the concentrated dependence on any single maritime corridor creates vulnerabilities that adversaries can exploit, whether through state naval forces, proxy actors, or the mere credible threat of action that is sufficient to alter insurance markets and commercial behavior. The sustained employment of high-end naval destroyers and cruisers to protect commercial shipping represents a striking reversal of the post-Cold War assumption that major maritime trade routes could be treated as effectively secure without dedicated naval protection. The cost of maintaining a naval escort capability in the Red Sea, in terms of ship operating costs, munitions expenditure, personnel tempo, and opportunity cost, runs into the hundreds of millions of dollars per month for a serious deployment. This expenditure is, in effect, a subsidy to commercial shipping, the transfer of security costs from the private commercial sector to public naval budgets. The tension between this arrangement and the commercial shipping industry's expectation of free or low-cost maritime security is one that will become increasingly difficult to sustain as the frequency and geographic distribution of maritime security challenges grows. Some analysts and naval thinkers have begun to revisit the economics of convoy operations, the system of grouping commercial vessels and providing them with dedicated naval escort, as a potentially more cost-effective and more reliably protective alternative to the distributed patrol model. And the convoy system's disadvantage is the scheduling disruption it imposes on commercial shipping operations. But the alternative, unlimited individual transits hoping that naval forces will be positioned to respond in time, has demonstrated limitations in the Red Sea context. One of the less remarked but strategically significant consequences of sustained maritime insecurity in the Bab el-Mandeb region is its effect on the behavior of regional states and the militarization of the maritime environment. The Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and others have invested heavily in naval capability over the past decade, partly in response to the Iranian maritime threat in the Gulf, but increasingly in response to the demonstrated vulnerability of their own sea lanes in the Red Sea. Or the UAE's establishment of a military base at Asab in Eritrea reflects this calculation, positioning naval and air assets adjacent to the strait to give the UAE a direct role in its security, rather than depending entirely on coalition or U.S. naval forces. China's military base in Djibouti, the first overseas military installation for the People's Liberation Army Navy, reflects a similar, if differently motivated, calculation. China's massive trade dependence on the Red Sea-Suez corridor gives Beijing a direct strategic interest in the security of Bab el-Mandeb, and the Djibouti base positions China to contribute to, or monitor, maritime security operations in the area. But the concentration of foreign military bases and naval forces in Djibouti represents a microcosm of the broader trend. The progressive militarization of commercial sea lanes in response to asymmetric maritime threats that states cannot address through commercial or diplomatic means alone. The economic architecture of global trade is not infinitely rigid. Sustained disruption to the Bab el-Mandeb corridor creates incentives for structural changes that, over the long term, could reshape some elements of global supply chains. Rail connections between Asia and Europe, the China-Europe rail corridors through Central Asia, represent an alternative to maritime shipping for certain cargo categories. They are significantly more expensive per unit than maritime shipping, but immune to maritime chokepoint disruption. Sustained elevated freight rates on the sea route reduce the relative cost premium of rail, making some cargo migration toward rail economically viable. Nearshoring and supply chain regionalization, already underway as a response to COVID disruption and geopolitical risk more broadly, become more attractive when maritime supply chains demonstrate sustained vulnerability. A European manufacturer that sources components from Southeast Asia through the Bab el-Mandeb corridor will, after repeated disruptions, look more seriously at European or Turkish suppliers, regardless of the unit cost differential. These adjustments are slow, measured in years and decades rather than weeks, but the directionality is clear. Structural maritime insecurity at key choke points accelerates the slow drift toward shorter, more resilient supply chains, and even at the cost of economic efficiency. The strategic summary: a control point in global logistics architecture. Bab el-Mandeb is not simply a piece of geography, it is a control point. a node in a global logistics architecture through which an enormous share of the world's trade must pass. Its importance derives not from what it is, but from what it connects. The Suez Canal, the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aden, the Indian Ocean, and through these the entire arc of global trade between the manufacturing centers of Asia and the consumer markets of Europe and the Americas. The vulnerability of this control point is a function of its geometry. Narrow, close to unstable coastlines, accessible to asymmetric maritime threats that even a decade ago would have been the exclusive province of major state navies. The proliferation of precision-guided anti-ship weapons to non-state actors has extended the range of entities capable of threatening commercial shipping in this corridor far beyond what was historically conceivable. Managing this vulnerability requires sustained investment in maritime domain awareness, naval escort capability, and the diplomatic frameworks that make multinational maritime security cooperation possible. It requires commercial shipping companies and maritime insurers to incorporate realistic threat assessments into their operational and pricing decisions. It requires port states, flag states, and coastal states to maintain the information sharing and coordination mechanisms that allow the maritime community to respond collectively to emerging threats. None of these requirements are new. All of them are being tested. The Bab el-Mandeb will continue to be a critical node in the global logistics system for as long as the Suez Canal route remains the economically dominant path for Asia-Europe trade. The question is not whether it will be tested again. That is a certainty. The question is how well the global maritime security system, the commercial shipping industry, and the naval forces that underwrite maritime security have learned from each previous test. The answer to that question will determine not just the security of a 30-kilometer stretch of water at the southern end of the Arabian Peninsula, but the reliability of the global supply chains that hundreds of millions of people depend on without ever knowing what they are or where they run.